Welcome back to Ray's Talk Show. This is your host, Ray Collazo. Thank you so much for joining us. You can catch Ray's Talk Show, the Latino political podcast out there, talking about the issues that impact our community from our perspective. You can check us out anywhere you can download a podcast at iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or check out all of our content at rayspodcast.com. That's RAYS podcast.com. And you can check out Ray's Podcast on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, anywhere you can find Ray's Podcast. Thank you again so much for joining us. First of all, our hearts, prayers, love goes out to the people of the Gulf Coast of this country, communities like Corpus Christi, Houston, and everywhere in between in that part of the world. Unfortunately, is being hit with a devastating storm, which unfortunately doesn't appear to be letting up for several more days. You've already seen the images on television of people being saved out of their home, evacuated from their homes, with basically the shirt on their back. And we just hope and pray that the damage and the fatalities and the injuries are at an absolute minimum through this process. And we only hope that and find solace in the fact that, and again, you're seeing this on TV day and night, the spirit of humanity, which is a theme of our conversation today. How do we, in the spirit of these attacks that are taking place, particularly to our community, but really sort of the fabric of this country as a democracy is under attack. In the midst of this very crazy, scary time for many of us, you see the overwhelming amount of positive and loving people that care about their fellow man, in the heroism of these volunteers, whether they're first responders or they're just men and women or civilians that are grabbing their boat, going around the neighborhood, picking up rescuees, picking up, helping their fellow neighbors and friends. So it's interesting that in the middle of these interviews, you see people interacting, and it's amazing how racism goes away real quick when you have a moment like this, and maybe an African American's helping Caucasian, or a Latinos helping someone else of a different background. That nobody's worried about your documentation when you're getting your life saved. You ain't worried about the person's documentation or anything like that. So it's or what if they speak with an accent. So when we get to these moments, we realize that, and it is a theme of this conversation today, that even in the darkness, there's light at the end of the tunnel, and there's light right around the corner. In a little while, you're going to hear from kind of getting a real local perspective, the ground zero of this ongoing battle for our civil liberties in Arizona. I'm talking about author, activist, now playwright, and artist James Garcia, who many of you know from his work over the years as a journalist and activist, and the great work he's done, now currently being based back in Phoenix, Arizona. He's been on the front lines as an activist and as a artist, dealing for over a decade with the scourge of Sheriff Arpaio. And of course, he's now back in the news and in prominence because of President Trump's shameful pardon of this man, this sheriff, who is one of the great violators of civil rights in this country. You think about a modern day Bull Connor. I don't know if Jim Crow was as devious and as evil in his approach to dealing with people of color, and in this case Latinos, who he perceived to be immigrants, all of us. That shameful pardon, which again, James is going to give us a little more of his local perspective and how he's speaking out through the arts in his play 1070, We Were Strangers Once Too. You're going to hear more about that in a second, but I just wanted to say from my perspective on the Arpaio situation, we can't overstate how despicable this pardon of this man was before he was even sentenced, by the way. But beyond just the breaking all of the norms of the political process, the process that presidents have used for centuries in this country, the process of pardoning, which is very rare. Typically, presidents do it at the end of their term, when they can face sort of minimal political backlash. And again, it's in rare cases, usually dealing with someone that may have even committed a wrong, but possibly the sentence was exorbitant. So people that have already kind of paid their dues to some degree, regardless of how you feel about the severity of their crimes. In this case, he hadn't paid any dues. And this is a slap in the face, particularly to the Latino community, particularly to people that care about immigrant rights, human rights, but really to all Americans, because this is a signal to our president, that he really doesn't care about the rule of law, doesn't care about, doesn't care about any of us. And to those that are still holding on to some hope that this man may do something for them, they may, generate job creation in their local community, or, shame on you for allowing your desperation, your frustrations to put so many people in harm and in danger. In fact, you may have already been negatively affected. Certainly, there's a good chance you were negatively affected if that health care bill had passed. Because if not you, someone in your close family would have lost their health care. Or certainly, most likely, your health care would have gone up significantly. So, I just want to reiterate the fact how disgusting this man is, Sheriff Arpaio. How, quite honestly, we could do multiple shows about the atrocities. We're going to touch on it with James, but the atrocities. And let it be no doubt, you want to get into the subjective analysis of who's a racist, who's not. This administration, time and time again, has shown you their cards by their actions, by empowering the DOJ to implement policies that are laser focused on throwing more people of color in jail and infringing on the civil liberties of really all Americans, considering this attack on all of our voting rights, but particularly people of color, the poor, the disabled. And going to these latest round of discriminatory actions, the transgender service ban for people that the bravest of us who don't get drafted into this military, those that, serve voluntarily to be on the front line serving in this country. And just because of your sexual orientation, President Trump doesn't believe that you are qualified or fit to serve this country, when he's the biggest coward of them all. And lastly, a word on Sheriff Joe Arpaio. You are a disgusting, evil man. And ultimately, one of the things I'm going to talk to James about in a moment here on Ray's Talk Show is that ultimately we must find solace in the fact that he will get his punishment, and most likely fairly soon, by the ultimate judge. Because someone that sees other human beings just because they have a different accent, just because they have a certain skin tone, or their backgrounds from a particular nationality, to treat them in a subhuman light, just Google it. Tense prisons, inhumane conditions, denying detainees, many of which were never even convicted of a crime, just in a holding pattern. Medicines, denying them food. The shackles, the inhumane treatment of tens of thousands of people during this terroristic reign. I think if a lot of these right-wing fools at this point, people that are willfully ignorant of what's really happening here, if they could just be sat down and shown video footage of really what happened, I think after 5 minutes they would be so devastated that they are co-signing this kind of behavior in our country. Hopefully we'll get this chance. Let's listen to James Garcia. Again, really excited to have a great friend to the show to talk about what's happening, what is the feeling on the ground of the Latino community and people throughout the state of Arizona, and what do we do next, and how James is approaching and educating people, entertaining people about the stories of our community that are often not told through his work in theater. He's got a great play out. It actually just ended its run in Phoenix, 1070. We Were Strangers Once Too. He's going to talk about that play and talk about how you can bring it to your city. He wants to actually bring it to Texas very soon, and we want everyone to support James Garcia. So let's begin the interview with James Garcia, and I'll be back later to wrap up the show. We're happy to have on the line a great friend of mine from Arizona that we really recently reconnected. And unfortunately, because of these circumstances, it just seemed very appropriate that we have this conversation because my good friend is not only in the middle of the action in Arizona, sort of the ground zero of this attack on our community and really the democratic principles of our country, but also through his work in the arts is doing something about it and sharing our community story, which has often been unheard. So my good buddy, great to hear back from him, James Garcia. James, welcome to Ray's Talk Show.
Ray, thanks so much, man. Thanks for having me on. It's wonderful to, as you put it, reconnect because we had not seen each other for quite a while. But also, I guess to reconnect under these circumstances, right? I mean, in some ways, it seems appropriate. All the things that are going on in our country and here in Arizona, and with regards to immigration and a whole variety of things. So, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, no, and great to connect with you and the family, and thank you because I know you just came from. We're going to talk about your play 1070. We Were Strangers Once Too. We're going to talk a little bit more of that in a second, but you actually just finished another run at the local theater, Herberger Theater there in Phoenix. So thank you for this valuable time on a Sunday night, James. Let's just start with it. 72 hours ago, we all, I think collectively, the people in our network, whether they're Latino or Arizonans or people that just have their wits about them, about what's happening in this country, felt a big punch in the gut on Friday night when President Trump, it's even hard saying that, announced his pardoning of former Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio. So James, just first of all, just share with us your personal, and I know you released a statement about it, which I wanted to ask you about as well, but just your personal reactions. And I know you were hours later with a group of Latino leaders on the ground, formally responding at a media event. So just if you could just give us a flavor of the kind of what our folks you're feeling and what our folks were feeling and continue to feel over the last few days in Arizona.
Well, I guess before I can quite answer that, I think I need to give you a little bit of context, and the context is this for folks who aren't familiar with Senate Bill 1070, which passed here in 2010. Arizona on that day kind of became ground zero in the national immigration debate. But what people need to understand is that bill, which at that time was the single most draconian anti-immigrant bill in the country, and probably spawned and inspired hundreds of other similar types of legislation around the country. That was the culmination of a process, right? I mean, there have been a lot of things happening in the years leading up to that, not just here in Arizona, but around the country. And that bill passed, and it literally was such a shock on the community, and particularly the immigrant community, that it drove tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of immigrants and their family members out of this state, and they fled to other states: Colorado, New Mexico, Louisiana, California, which is some of the places. And some of them went home. Some of them went back to where they had come from, whether it was Mexico or Latin America or Central America or other places. And so the state has lived through that. I was here. I was working as a journalist at the time and teaching here in the community and so on and so forth. And I was also a playwright. I've been writing plays for many, many years, and I've been writing plays almost since as long as I've been here in Arizona. In fact, one of the first plays I wrote was a short play about a group of people who had died crossing the Arizona desert, a group of immigrants, and I wrote a piece inspired by that, a short play called The Crossing. So I don't only write about immigrations, but I've been touching on this as a writer for quite a while. But what happened, Friday was, part of what has happened since 2010 is that, believe it or not, and most of the country doesn't know about this because it doesn't get reported on a lot, is that there have been a number of victories against the hard right anti-immigrant contingent of folks, and one of those victories was the first ouster of Sheriff Joe Arpaio. He's an elected official. He was an elected official. He was defeated at the polls last year after 23 years in office, and really leading a kind of reign of terror that did not just impact by any means Latinos and immigrants, but mentally ill people in his jails, women, and a whole slew of other people who were injured really by the way he carried out justice. And so the victory last year was that he was ousted, that he was thrown out of office, and he was replaced in a very decisive election. And people cheered that, of course, right, because we had been through some very tough times. And then another victory came along, and that second victory was that he was convicted of a crime. A man who had been in law enforcement 40 plus years of his life, maybe 50 years of his life, after all that he had done here and all of the complaints and lawsuits against him and on, he was finally convicted in a court of law of a criminal contempt charge for, and this is perhaps somewhat poetic and apropos. His crime was that he ignored a federal judge's instructions to stop racially profiling Latinos and immigrants. Right?
And flagrantly. I mean, part of the reason he was convicted on that charge was that he was pretty. I mean, he admitted on Univision interviews that he was flagrantly.
He was on the air. He was on tape saying, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing, and nobody's going to make me stop, and et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, that was a great victory, and I think that after, if you understand what people have been through here, particularly the immigrant community, particularly Latinos, and particularly undocumented immigrants, you can imagine that the elation to finally see this man at least facing some nominal form of justice. I mean, it was a criminal contempt charge, it was a felony, but it was still a misdemeanor. So was it as he was going to spend years in jail. At best, he might spend 6 months in jail, right? And he's an old man, so who knows? The judge might have said, I'm going to give you probation, for 2 years or whatever. But there was still a sense of elation about the fact that perhaps justice had finally been done. And on Friday, of course, President Trump, in only the way that President Trump can do these things, essentially pulled the rug out from all of that and pardoned the man before he was sentenced, and pardoned him and basically suggested that this was a man who deserved to be pardoned because he was just doing his job. Well, the fact of the matter is he wasn't just doing his job. He was going above and beyond, and he was discriminating against people, and it was documented, and on and on. And so it was a punch in the gut. You're right. I mean, it was an incredible punch in the gut. But it was one of these things where I think people involved in these issues who have been following Arpaio's career and following Trump, of course, for the last couple of years, understood that this was a real possibility, right? That this was something that could very likely happen. But as I've described it to people, it's kind of a little bit like, like you're indoors somewhere and you're around a bunch of people and someone comes into the room and says, hey, somebody outside was just shot. And you go, oh, wow, that's it's shocking and upsetting and so on and so forth. It's the difference between that, kind of knowing that reality may have existed, and watching a man get shot. And I think that's what happened on Friday night to people who were involved in this issue, who maybe knew it was coming, but to see it happen right before your eyes, to see the President of the United States denigrate the office of the presidency, and to stoop to such a level that he would literally pardon a man who had not even been sentenced for such a crime, it was just shocking. It was just shocking. It was stunning. And it was an affront, of course, not just to Latinos by any means. It wasn't just that he had been hunting our people, and that's what he was doing. He was hunting our people. It wasn't just that. It was that he was ripping to shreds fundamental ideas that we all have about democracy, which is that that no one is above the law, that there should be equal justice. It's a fundamental understanding as an American. As anyone who comes to this country and wants to live by the rules of this country, we understand that a fundamental core understanding is that equal justice should be meted out to all, and that no one should be above the law. And Trump destroyed that in one swipe of one swish of his pen, if you will. Right? And I think that's that the ramifications of that and the ripple effects of that are not just shocking to us here on the ground who have been dealing with this, but I think to everyone across the country who has an understanding about what the presidency should represent, what justice should represent, what our legal system should represent. And frankly, I think so many of us are feeling as if, are we living in the Philippines now? Is that guy our president? Right? Are all the rules just getting thrown out the window? And I think that's where we are. And I think people are still reeling and trying to figure out how to respond to it.
Yeah, it was. I'll tell you, and thank you, James, because you had actually live streamed a press conference that featured a host of, from Congressman Ruben Gallego to legal leaders, many of the Latino lawyers that have been leading this fight against Sheriff Joe that ultimately led to his conviction months ago. People like Denny Ortega and other community leaders like Bethra Falcone and many others.
A politician, by the way, a politician who he's persecuted. Right? There was a politician in that room on that live stream, Mary Rose Wilcox, who used to be a county supervisor. Is someone that he persecuted. Mm-hmm. He abused his authority to basically go after her in a form of a vendetta because she basically had opposed his policies. And to the point where she actually sued him, and he lost an almost $1 million lawsuit against her. I mean, this is the track record the man has.
He cost. Talk about who's going to pay for it, right? He cost the Maricopa County residents, what was it, $100 million?
Well
legal challenges, legal costs. It's incredible. The guy was a total disaster.
The racial profiling case that Trump is basically now forgiving him for has already cost the county $9 million in legal costs. Right? It's astounding. It's just astounding that this man has gone, maybe getting away with murder.
Yeah. So I shared that press conference, and I was just on social media. I mean, all weekend, but really on Friday night in particular. And I tell you, James, our network of activists have been, on edge and cranky all year for obvious reasons, because quite honestly, on some level, we're not only upset about, for all the thoughtful reasons you just laid out of this attack on our civil liberties, attack on the rule of law in this country and everything else. But, when a direct insult to your folks, it's like spitting in your face, right? So the anger and the vitriol, and it's almost like, and you could sense it from the social media response. It was like, and prick, you had to do this on a Friday night. Like, you had to ruin our weekend too. You couldn't be a man about it and stand up in front of in front of reporters on a Tuesday afternoon and talk about this. You had to do it like a coward, like he does everything. Can't even fire people. The guy's a total prick.
I have a sister who has a house in Rockport, Texas, right? The eye of the hurricane, right?
Oh my
God. Good news is today she found out it seems that her house has survived the storm. But to think that this man does something that is such an affront to not just us, not just Latinos, but to all Americans who believe, again, in this judicial system that we're all supposed to live by, to do it in the midst of the kind of suffering that people must be enduring during a hurricane, during a national, crisis, right? A weather crisis. It just speaks volumes about the man's lack of sensitivity or morality, for that matter. His limits abound. It's just amazing. It's amazing what he's capable of.
Yeah, I tell you what, between this pardon, what's happening, and I'm glad you brought it up. Of course, our love and prayers are with our folks in the Gulf Coast region of Texas, Houston, Corpus Christi, and that whole community. The potential decision on whether or not DACA the coming weeks will remain law through executive order, and then of course I mean, just the hits keep going and going, and then of course SB4 is about to start being implemented in the state of Florida, state of Texas. So essentially 1070 full circle. So just a larger Latino community is going to have to deal with this nonsense. You're listening to James Garcia, author, activist, and playwright and play director and play producer. He's going to talk about his play 1070. We Were Strangers Once Too. In a moment, and we're just catching up here on the aftermath of the shameful pardoning of Sheriff Joe Arpaio. James, I want to read the opening line in the public statement that you released on Friday night around this scourge to our nation, referring to the pardoning of Joe Arpaio. Trump's pardon of Arpaio is a pardon of racism in America. And I wanted to ask you about this from the perspective of language, because one of the things that has been so frustrating in this ongoing debate about Trump and his policies and the impact of his administration is those that are either apologists for him or, are simply sort of living in their own world around what this all means. Many of them like to get into this rhetorical argument around, well, you don't know he's a racist. And even the dunces that go on TV, like, I've known him 20 years and I've never heard him say the N-word around me or call anyone a name or, I know him and I know his heart. And, the reality is, I think the evidence is pretty strong, but this is subjective. Him being a quote unquote racist or not, first of all, is subjective and really not really that important at the end of the day. The point is that the policies, the rhetoric that he spews, and the policies that he's implementing or trying to implement, are blatantly racist. And so, can you talk a lot about the language of this conversation? Because it's been interesting how the term white supremacy has become part of the vernacular. I think even a few years ago, it would have been hard to find the mainstream media and mainstream conversation even touching that language. That was the kind of language that was pretty much just stayed within the halls of progressive academia. And now it's part of the lexicon of this conversation. But the term even racism and how racism is experienced every day in this country by folks and institutionalized, which is really what we're talking about here, institutionalized racism. There's still, even well-intentioned people are still uncomfortable talking about this, and for some reason, even more so with Latinos, is sort of a question of discrimination, of racism, if you want to use the term white supremacy. So, talk about the as a journalist and as a writer, talk about the language of these conversations, and how that's impacting how we talk about it and how we can develop more understanding.
I think, ultimately, I think what you're speaking to is kind of the novelty of the times that we are in, right? I mean, I think that it's safe to say that over the course of my life, that and I'm older than you are, and if I look back at sort of the historical, the record, if you will, I was literally born into an era in which America still had signs that said on the restaurant doors that said things like "No Mexicans" or "Dogs Allowed," right? And we had signs that said, on water fountains, for whites only, et cetera, right? We know all of it. We know all of those things primarily from history books, right? But I'm just old enough that I was born into that. And then over the course of my life, fortunately, I think for not just me, but for most of us, particularly people of color, as time progressed, it became steadily less acceptable, right, to say things like that, to engage in behavior that essentially amounted to Jim Crow kind of policies, to publicly denigrate people simply because of their ethnicity or their language or their accents or their nationality, and on and on. And I think that this has been the progress that we have made. When people say, "Oh, we haven't made any progress at all," I think that's an absurd statement. I think we have made progress, and we've moved away from that kind of language and that kind of behavior in a blatant, unsanctioned sort of way. There were sanctions against that. It was unacceptable to speak in those terms. And so as time has gone by, I think mainstream America had gotten increasingly skittish about using terms like white supremacy, right? Like neo-Nazi, and the kinds of language that we're sort of hearing used today, particularly very recently, right? Particularly since the advent of Trump, and particularly since the advent of the Trump administration, right? And all of that is to say that we've avoided using those terms because they're extremely radioactive, right? They're radioactive terms, and people needed to reserve that terminology for that minority that existed and basically sort of lived in the shadows of this American democratic system that had lived 50 years since the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, right? And we believed, I think, that, and I still believe this largely, but we believed we had moved far enough away from that when you called someone a white supremacist, you had to be really clear. Right? It had to be absolutely clear who that person was. But related to that is a kind of sense in America by most people that we can't possibly live in a society 50 years after the passage of civil rights. America can't really be institutionally racist, can it? There can't really be that many of them out there, can there? If I happen to sympathize with some of the things that white supremacists like and do, that couldn't possibly really make me a white supremacist, could it? I mean, there's a kind of unwillingness in America to acknowledge, the truth about where we have come from. Right? The other day, I was listening to someone being interviewed, and they said, we lived through 250 or 300 years of slavery, and then about another 100 years of Jim Crow, and then we had about 50 years of life after the Civil Rights Act. When you put it in that context, we have been a racist country for a lot longer than we have been a country, right, that has in any way seemed to have been enlightened, right? And I have always said this. I have always said, if someone tells you that they're living a life that is as a consequence of literally just in this country centuries of racist institutionalized policies such as slavery, such as second-class citizenship. I wrote a play about people who worked in the copper mines just outside of Phoenix, Arizona, in the 1930s, who Mexicans at the time got paid literally half of what white workers got paid in the same mines, doing exactly the same job. And why? Because they were Mexican. That's it. Right? That was it. And when we think about it in the scheme of things, if we have been enlightened, if we were enlightened by the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, we haven't been enlightened all that damn long, right? But nevertheless, Americans who have, and I'm including myself in that, I'm an American, we have a short attention span. We have a short memory, right? We're not like people in Mexico who still despise Hernan Cortés as if he just, walked onto the hemisphere yesterday. We tend to forget things pretty quickly, right? And so we like to imagine that, oh, no, it's been 50 years, damn it. We're enlightened, we're progressive, we've moved on, nobody's really a racist anymore. And I think what we're seeing is any cursory reading of history teaches you that great empires, at some point, great empires, like anything, do not last forever. And great empires, at some point, there's some trigger, there is some moment in the history of that empire that begins to unravel things, right? Now, I don't think really, truly in my heart that we are there yet. I think this country probably still has a good measure of time to go before that inevitable collapse of the empire happens. But what I think is happening right now is it should be a reminder to us about the fragility of democracy, about the fragility of the freedoms that literally it has taken us this long to get here from that first shot that was fired in the Revolutionary War, right? We did not become truly free people on the day we declared our independence. It took 300 years almost, right? It took 250 years for us to even get to this point where somehow the Civil Rights Act at least made us believe on some level that we have finally become enlightened enough, that we can start to be proud of who we are and our Bill of Rights and our Constitution and all of those. So we're starting to finally live up to the promises of the Bill of Rights. But what's happening now is a reminder of the fragility of that and how we have to all fight for it, because if we don't, it will unravel, right? Adolf Hitler did not arrive on the scene in Germany a complete genocidal maniac. He had to become one. And he arrived on the scene an outlier, a fanatic, someone who people did not believe could possibly gain power. And after years, he became finally the genocidal maniac that he became. Right? Is that our fate? I don't believe so, and I certainly hope not. But what it tells us is that fascism, which I believe in my heart has arrived in the White House, fascism does not come fully developed, fully mature. It arrives in a kind of infantile state, and then it grows into the job. And I think that that's what we should all be worried about. We need to stop it before that happens.
That's right. And you can play the "I told you so" game so long, kind of thinking about his comments around President Trump's comments during the election, specifically to African Americans, like, well, your lives are shit. What do you got to lose? And we were saying a year ago, there's plenty we can lose. So, and many of our friends from Latin America and around the world who came to this country more recently than you and I, James, can speak to the fact that, hey, there's, we've seen when fat in their countries, they've seen where things take an ugly turn like this. And unfortunately, seeing the same symptoms. There was a blogger online this morning that wrote a piece around. She left Cuba because of this kind of behavior. Now she's seeing the same signs here. So, there's a lot of parallels. And again, when you even would bring that up, I went on a friend's podcast earlier this year, and I said, well, we have to. This is. It may not end that way, but this is how Nazi Germany started. And if you don't believe me, think about what you think about Germany now. Probably at this point, probably the most stable democracy, richest democracy in the world. And you wouldn't have thought 70 years ago Hitler was running the show. So it wouldn't seem possible doing what it is now, but we can certainly go through a phase like that. And on some level, we already are doing that. And you listen to James Garcia, a great friend from Arizona, someone that's on the front lines as an activist, as a thinker, and also an artist. We're going to talk about his play 1070. We Were Strangers Once Too. My last question before we get into the play, James, where you were with really the core of our political and activist leadership Friday evening. I know there's lots of conversations happening even into the weekend. What's your sense of where our community is now? What are some of the next steps we're going to see from our actions, from our leadership down in Arizona, as best you can tell,
some ways,
while these wounds are still fresh?
The conversation about the play 1070, and I'll tell you what, because one of the things that my play talks about, it tries to illustrate, is that there's a central character in that play who is a young woman who, when the play begins, is undocumented, does not have DACA, does not have the temporary deferred action for childhood arrivals that President Obama authorized to allow now 800,000 young immigrants to remain in the country temporarily. She didn't have that. She began her work in 2010, like so many other young activists here, without the protection of DACA. And yet she gained power. She flexed muscles. She organized. She joined with others to organize against what was happening here in Arizona under that bill, SB 1070, and nationally what was happening on these issues as well. Right? And that's that character. And I mention that because Arizona is a very different place than it was before the passage of SB 1070. Before the passage of SB 1070, there were certainly some very dedicated and committed activists who were trying to push back on these issues and trying to sound the alarm about the direction that the state was going and what that might have to do with the national conversation on these issues. But the truth of the matter is that as a result of the passage of that bill, that it sparked, lit a spark among so many in the state, so many activists, so many community leaders, some of them older, some of them who have been here literally fighting on these issues since the days of Cesar Chavez, but perhaps most significantly, it created this kind of wildfire of activism among very young people who in 2010 were in their teens, and now are in their 20s, and maybe some of them are 30-ish or something, right? And multiple organizations have been created, and those organizations have linked up with national organizations all over the country, including organizations like Unidos US and others, and Fern and America's Voice, and on and on and on. And it's this network that has been created, and it's very strong here in Arizona now. And that was the reaction to 1070 that led to a series of victories that are worth noting, right? And one of them was getting Arpaio out of office. One of them was the recall of the president of the Senate that proposed that bill and shoved it through. That person was recalled, the first Senate president in the state's history ever to be recalled. And he was recalled by activists organizing in his district and knocking on doors and registering people to vote. The former Attorney General, Tom Horn, another complete bigot, anti-immigrant, who ran, also by the way, who ran for office, when he ran for office, with a campaign sign that said nothing but this: I support SB 1070. That's all it said. And he got elected the first time. He's since been ousted. And there's been a whole series of victories that have been things that have succeeded and pushed back immigration legislation in the state legislature has essentially been shut down virtually completely since 2010. There have not been other bills. So all of this is to say, the activist groups, the movement, the people who are their allies, who believe that the kind of mentality that drove SB 1070, which is the same mentality that is driving the White House right now, they organized and they pushed back. And Arizona is a better place today for that having happened, right? Because people pushed back. And so this event, the pardoning of Sheriff Joe Arpaio, is a slap in the face. It is certainly cannot be categorized by any means as a victory for the movement because Trump has used essentially the sort of the nuclear weapon, that he could use to sort of exact his policy, his agenda, his bigoted agenda. But what I can say unequivocally is that this community and people all over the country who are our allies are organizing in ways like never before, and they will keep pushing, and they will keep pushing back. And the kinds of victories that we saw happen here in the state of Arizona between 2010 and 2007, I believe in my heart are going to be realized on a national scale.
And you're listening to James Garcia here on Ray's Talk Show. Again, you can check out Ray's Talk Show, where we really are a home for Latinos and others to have the kind of conversations related to politics and issues impacting us around the country. Unfortunately, you don't see James Garcia on MSNBC or CNN as nearly as often as we'd like, and people from his perspective. So we need to have more independent spaces like James is creating with his Play 1070 to have these conversations, tell these stories, and really have, as the Phoenix New Times referred to the play, a theatrical call to action. And action is We have to put that action into words. And again, listen to James, the gains that we made in Arizona. We've made a lot of positive gains, and especially with young leadership stepping up, not only organizing, but running for office themselves. Not only do we have the young rising star like Congressman Gallego, who's a friend, but also a real strong delegation of city council people, school board members, new members of the house, newer members of the Arizona House of Representatives. So Arizona is definitely in good young hands. And again, you can check out our podcast anywhere. You can download a podcast. We're on Spotify now, James. You can check us out on Spotify in between your tunes. And you can always email the show at podcastraise@gmail.com. That's podcastraise@gmail.com if you just want to connect with us or recommend a topic or anything else. James, so tell us about 1070. We Were Strangers Once Too. I know you've had a couple of runs of the show over the summer. You're down in Phoenix at the Herberger Theater. I didn't get a chance to see it, but really impressed by all the reviews of other friends of mine that got to see it. And it seemed like it was at a beautiful theater in downtown Phoenix. It's very impressive structure. So tell us about what inspired you to develop this play.
We did our second run at a smaller space called the Helen K. Mason Performing Arts Center, which is the home of the Black Theater Troupe, which is where we just closed. But all of that is to say that this is a play that I have been writing plays for a very long time. I've actually written more than 30 plays, all told in my life. And I'll be completely honest. I'm sure that the first half dozen or so were pretty much thinkers, but but I've written a lot of plays. And most recently, in most recent years, I've been writing plays that are either inspired by what's happening literally in real time around me, or stories, historical stories that I think in many ways speak to the issues that we're facing today. And so this particular play, 1070, is 1070 as a bill in the state of Arizona, and in terms of what it sparked around the country in terms of immigration and conversations around it, was one of the single most important historical events, certainly in the state of Arizona. And if you think about the fallout from it, I think with regards to the subject of immigration, that 1070 was probably one of the single most important historical events with regards to immigration issues in the country, probably in the last century. There's one of a handful of things that have happened over the course of the last century, and this is one of them. And why is it so important? Why first of all, it's natural drama, right? I mean, it's a story that, as a dramatist, has villains and heroes and conflict and trauma and et cetera, et cetera. And so it naturally lent itself to a dramatic retelling. But for me, it also was something that I felt like I need to tell this story, not just because it's good drama, because I think I can keep people in the seats and make them want to wait till intermission, and then have them think they're in intermission. I got to go back in and see that play. You want to do that as a playwright, no matter what you do. But it was also really important because what I observed during the course of these years was I watched people with no power, as I mentioned earlier, young people, undocumented people, who in the scheme of the American politic, for all practical purposes, had no power, right? Because they can't vote. They generally don't have a lot of money, so they can't, lobby a bunch of people. They can't donate big dollars to campaigns. All of the measures that we in modern American politics sort of abide by, right? These were, for all practical purposes, if they're working, they tend, not always, but tend to not.
They're also too busy working to have much time to do much of anything else.
People who have political influence. And yet, they moved things. They changed America. They convinced and pressured President Obama to do things that he might not otherwise have done. No matter how good of a man he was in the scheme of politics, they pushed him into places that he didn't feel that comfortable in, but he went there, right? And one of those things was DACA, right? And one of those things was later he tried to provide temporary legal status to the parents of DACA, right? And on, right? And so I watched people courageous things without the protection of the law on their side. They literally, at any moment, at any protest, could have been swept up by the kind of people who might want to sweep them up, like people like Sheriff Arpaio, and put into trucks and driven to the border and ordered to walk across, the border, and they would be, gone from forever unless they somehow got smuggled back into the country, right? And I thought that was amazing. I still think it's amazing to watch people have done that, right? And so my lead character in this play is a young woman named Vivi Avila, who, her name is Dulce Avila. And Dulce Avila is one of many Dulce Avilas who I've met over the last decade here in Arizona. There are multiple Dulce Avilas who have taken up, this cause and have fought, leading organizations, have created organizations, and who have had, things that have not just, they're fighting on behalf, by no means, just for themselves. They're fighting on behalf of their community, and frankly, they're fighting on behalf of this democracy. I have seen young, undocumented immigrant Americans do things that I believe are some of the most democratic, small d, kinds of things that I've ever seen any American do, right? And it makes, and it has taught me, it's like, oh, yeah, that's what democracy is all about, right? What they're doing right now, knocking on doors, fighting, registering people to vote, informing people, educating them, even when they can't vote themselves. I mean, how much more democratic can you get, right? To register people to vote in an election that you can't even vote in, right? I mean, it's hard enough to get Americans to show up and vote, on election day, much less. And I've seen this happen again and again, and I thought, this is a story that has to be told. And it's a story that has to be told because these people didn't fight frivolously. They didn't just go out and fight and struggle and then lose every single war and go home crying. No, they have victories that they can measure. They have victories. And frankly, right now, I mean, as horrific as I think experiences have been now under Donald Trump, I believe that what we are seeing is a cornered rat. This is a man whose sphere of influence is diminishing every day, and he knows it. And he's cornered, and he's lashing out like a wounded animal. And unfortunately, he will probably do a lot more damage before he leaves office, than we can possibly imagine. But the truth of the matter is that every day that goes by, this man's sphere of influence is shrinking, not growing. And we, those of us who believe that our country should not be led by a fascist, but should be led by someone who believes in the Constitution and democracy, we will overcome this guy. It's just, unfortunately, it's not going to happen as fast as we all wish it would. And I wrote this play because it has characters in it who show you that if you struggle and you struggle for something that really is worth fighting for, like our Bill of Rights, like our Constitution, it doesn't even matter if you're a documented American, if you have documents, that you could still win. And I think that's a story worth telling, and I think that the audiences that have come to see this show, have understood that ultimately there's some inspiration that they feel at the end of the story. It doesn't have a happy ending, but it is inspiring.
That's right. I'm sorry. No, I'm sure. And maybe you can share a moment about the folks that are not engaged in immigrant issues and immigrant family issues on a day-to-day basis. I don't think have an appreciation for how much this issue creates such a strong fabric of family dynamics, in that, we almost all of these families that are dealing with the issues of immigrant status are mixed families, one way or another. There's some people in the family that are undocumented, and some people who aren't, and some people in the middle, and how destiny brings people together in a way that how the youngest kid may be able to go to college because he happened to be born on this side of the border and the others can't, and how that impacts. So share with us how your play 1070 deals with that part of the equation, because that
when I
also,
tell people
I'm sure, also
what I
brought
was
some of
trying
the
to achieve with
leads to
play,
some of the comedic moments in
really high
your
up on
play.
the list. Maybe the single most important thing I was trying to achieve was that I was trying to let people know that, when you talk about immigration and you watch the news and then you hear talking heads and politicians they talk about things like how many agents are going to be at the border and how much radar we're going to use and how high the wall is going to be and how many visas we're going to issue for people to come and work in the vineyards for Donald Trump in Virginia, or whatever, right? And they're talking about the policy, right? And what immigration really is, it's about immigrants, it's about families, it's about people. We're not talking about 11 to 12 million policy initiatives. We're talking about 11 to 12 million human beings who are in this country, living in the shadows, most of them in families. Most of those families are mixed status, meaning some people are legal, some people are not. Some people have permanent residency, some are U.S. born. In Arizona, after 1070 passed, which also happened to be about the time that the recession was hitting and really sinking in, 200,000 undocumented immigrants left the state, according to the Department of Homeland Security. 200,000 undocumented immigrants. Well, as you just mentioned, immigrants don't just live by themselves in studio apartments. They live with family, and again, it's mixed status families, and they have children, and they may have 2 or 3 or 4 children ultimately in the course of, say, 10 or 12 years or 15 years. And so when they left, they didn't leave by themselves. So now think about this. In a state that had 6.2 or 6.4 million people at the time 1070 was passed, just say conservatively that each undocumented immigrant left with one person. Somewhere in the range of nearly 500,000 people left this state. And anyone who believes that doesn't impact a society in intimate and intricate ways is delusional or completely uninformed, because it has an impact. It has an economic impact. It has a social impact. It has, there are, at the lower end, the lower rung, if you will, of the jobs. It's people whose nannies left. It's people, it's folks who thought they could depend on, quien sabe quién to come and mow their lawn. But there are also people who were entrepreneurs, who were undocumented immigrants, who were running small businesses, and on and on and on. And so it had a tremendous impact. And when we talk about immigration now in this country, we just forget that it's human beings that we're really talking about. So that's what this story was ultimately about. I wanted the audience to see that here's a family whose life went from one day to the next. It turned completely upside down, and they had to cope with that and try to figure it out. And there is, in this family, a U.S. citizen, a young man who's a U.S. citizen, who's really, frankly, at the beginning of the play, really arrogant about it, right? And he's basically telling his sister, maybe you should shut up, because if you don't shut up, and immigration comes after you, they're going to come after all of us, and they're going to deport our parents, and I'm going to be fine, but you guys are going to be in big trouble, and maybe you should shut up, right? And so that, that's a dynamic that exists, that was out there, that I was told by audiences. Thank you for touching on that, because that was part of the real conversation that families were having, right? Should we speak up? Should we speak up? Yeah. I've been really heartened, honestly. I really have, because
yeah, I wanted to ask you, James, about the reaction you've gotten
years ago, about 10
from
years ago, I wrote a play about Hispanic World War II
people that
veterans
have seen
called,
1070.
Voices of Valor. And the people that I wanted to, again, as a playwright, you want to write a good play. You want people not to get out of their seats in intermission and not come back, right? But when I asked myself, who do I think I need to connect with the most? Well, of course, it was the veterans, right? It was those 85-year-old guys, one guy, 91 years old, who came to see the play. And when they came and they said, basically, you got it right, then that's when I felt I got it right. And that's what happened here. In this play, when dreamers said you got it right, when people who work with immigrants, a young man today, Tony Navarrete, he's a state representative, but his parents are immigrants. He works literally every day with immigrants. when people like that say, you got it right, then I'm touched beyond belief, because that's the ultimate measure, is the authenticity of the storytelling. Right? It wasn't fake, right? People didn't feel like it was fake. Like these people aren't real, and that's been really powerful. I can't tell you how many times people have started to ask questions during a talkback after a show and broken down into tears because it affected their life. Right? One young woman literally ran out of the theater. I tracked her down later. It was someone that I knew, and I called her and asked her what happened, and she said, "Well, my mother's undocumented. She works cleaning office buildings. My father is in jail right now. When he gets out, he's going to be deported." So, and she was thankful for the story, right? And so that's, there are different measures for creative writers, and some of those have to do with just the craft of writing, and some of those have to do with how do you touch audiences, how do you reach audiences, what are you saying to them, and what are they spitting back to you?
And you're listening to James Garcia talking about 1070. His play "We Were Strangers" Once Two just finished to run a series of performances in Phoenix, Arizona over the summer. James, I know you're trying to spread the word, spread this this message, and I know you think it's appropriate to try to get this shown in Texas. Because in many ways, this is almost a preview of what they can expect with SB4.
Well,
very similar legislation than 1070 was. So let people know where they can find out more about the play and how they can contribute to you touring it throughout the Southwest. Hey, brother, you Google James Garcia. Who knows? There's all kind of people that are going to come up. I mean, my name's Rafael Collazo, and there's some young boy. I want to smash him because there's some kid named Rafael Collazo in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that keeps getting in trouble. So once we all Google our names. Let's not deny that we all do that. So once in a while, every couple, I don't know, every 2 or 3 days or something, I'll Google my name, just to, and then, once in every 6 months, this kid's going to jail. He's on mugshot.com. This kid's got to get his act together. Yeah, he's got to get it together. We're an interesting bunch. There's actually an eye doctor named Dr. Rafael Collazo, who's no relation to him, even though he's a local. He lives in Philadelphia. We're good friends. But he pops up there, and then there's actually a Republican Latino political leader in Connecticut named Rafael Collazo. So I have gotten accused once or twice of kissing up to the man, and I try to explain to people that's not me. I don't live in Connecticut, and we have gotten into some problem a few years ago in political scandal. So you just never know, man. So yeah, definitely we have to let people know where they can find you, James.
And we're trying to keep the tent open, if you will, and invite people in. But newcarpa.org, that's NEWCARPA.org. And our next step for this play is, now that we've closed the run here, is, you're right, we want to take it to Texas. We're going to launch a Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign sometime in the next several days, very, very soon. And the goal is to raise enough cash to get the play to Austin, Texas, maybe even San Antonio. And why? Because Texas signed into law a bill called Senate Bill 4, which is basically 1070 on steroids. And the sad truth is that, unlike when SB 1070 was signed, at that time President Obama sued the state of Arizona. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and virtually every major aspect of Senate Bill 1070 was overturned as unconstitutional by the courts. That may not happen this time, because, first of all, I'm sure that President Trump will not sue the state of Texas. Neither will Jeff Sessions, our Attorney General. And by the time the case made it to the Supreme Court, heaven forbid, there may yet be one more conservative judge added to that Supreme Court, and it will be a very different court than the court that heard 1070. And in the meantime, the reality is that Texas has 1.5 million undocumented immigrants and an extremely large Latino population, and so a lot of people are going to get hurt. A lot of people are going to suffer. A lot of people are going to face discrimination. Their lives are going to be turned upside we just feel like we need to take the play there, and show audiences in Texas, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we live through. We don't think you want to do it.
Yeah, no, thank you, James, and I really appreciate that. And as I shared with you offline, I want to start exploring how we can, at some point bring it to the East Coast. There's definitely some Latino cultural organizations that do, show plays, show musicals.
They can find me on Facebook.
And
James Garcia.
I definitely think there's some possibilities there. So definitely look out for 1070. We Were Strangers once too, and definitely check out James. James, let people know where they can find you on social media.
If you do Arizona theater, James Garcia, my stuff will pop up and you can find me easy. Reach out, if you want to know about other work that I'm doing, and the work that I do here in Arizona. I'm always here to try to kind of inform folks about kind of lessons learned since I've been here in this area. So, always willing to talk to folks.
Well, I appreciate you, James. Thank you so much, James Garcia. You're a great friend, and I'm glad to see that you're assisting and contributing to our community on many levels. And best of luck to spreading the message of 1070. I will do what I can to definitely help you spread the message. And again, you've been listening to James Garcia. I just continue to implore people listening to this program to resist and do what you can, whether it's working in local electoral politics, and we've seen some of the successes of that in Arizona over the last several years, calling your federal officials and holding them accountable to this tyrannical administration on their recent decisions. And, we still have the future of DACA hanging in a balance. I spoke to a group of non-Latino progressives recently in Pennsylvania around the need for them to start raising their voices around calling on their federal officials to support the continuation of the DACA program. And so there's just a lot of work to do.
Thank
Thank
you so much, Ray.
we're going to continue to support the great people of Arizona. And again, as James mentioned earlier, our prayers and thoughts with the community in Texas. Stay safe out there. Thank you so much, James.